Hey, there's a PSA right now. All you guys out there, remember to shut your valves. Because, it's no fun putting boiling liquid in and then, having it pour out everywhere. So for today's brew, we are going to be brewing a dry Irish stout. This is the recipe for it. Those up there are obviously the prices. That is my estimated figures with the Brewer's Friend calculator. We'll see how close we get to that today. That's the mash schedule. So we've already got the water boiling and we've already milled up the grains. So this is the dark toasted oats for this recipe. We made those yesterday. 500 degrees for 80 minutes with the last little bit under the broiler. They're not perfect, they're not entirely consistent, but without a drum roaster, I'm not sure how you get it perfectly consistent, but this stuff, when you take a sample of it, it tastes just like dark black roasted barley, so kind of like a dark, almost burned, acrid kind of coffee kind of flavor, so. Plus also with the extra proteins and starch in the unmalted grain, you're looking at a lot more flavor out of this than malt. Has had most of that removed through the modification process. So basically right now we're just waiting for all the hot water to get heated. Part of it's for the initial cereal mash to gelatinize the starches in the unmalted grain, but also the rest of it's going to be used for sparging, and we're going to put it in the convenient insulated hot liquor tank over there. So I didn't do this earlier, so I am going to explain a little more fully my actual process and how I do change it a little bit depending on the strength of the beer that I'm producing. But this is basically the basis of my process, which up in front, I use a lot of unmalted grain with some brewing sugars with a little bit of malt. It does change the flavor. It changes the flavor. It makes something very unique that most people aren't going to have with using all malts or what's commonly available, especially with home brewing. And what I see bleed over into commercial brewing, which in many ways I see most commercial brewers being just overgrown home brewers that are using the same kind of things that work on a homebrew scale, but may or may not really meet expectations for commercial. Anyways, here's what I've come up with over the last 10 years. I've stuck with this for last 5, and it's always come through, usually, unless my recipe calculator is completely off, which I just had an example of that where something in their catalog was wrong. I've since fixed that on my end. It usually comes out 100% perfect every time. So, step 1, toast everything. Everything needs to be toasted. That's where a lot of your flavor in beer comes from. It's from the toast. You weigh it after you toast it, not before, because the weight changes depending on how dark it gets. And then you mill everything, including your flaked grains and unmalted grains. Everything gets milled. I use a hammer mill. Personally, I prefer the hammer mill over a roller because 1, versatility, 2, it makes it fine and consistent. 2, I shoot for 1.75 quarts per pound in my mash total. I'm going to boil half of that and add it to my unmalted grains, and I'm going to hold that for 15 minutes in an insulated mash tun. This happens to be a cooler on a larger scale. Really, you're not going to lose that much temperature. So over the 15 minutes, so you can honestly just get away with just an uninsulated ton. Then you're going to add, after 15 minutes, you're going to add the other half of whatever it takes to get to that 1.75 quart. Add that at groundwater, 60, 70 degree groundwater. And then you're gonna add your malt. Should get you around 125. Obviously, you need to check that to confirm, because you don't want it to be too hot or too cold. Then you're gonna hold that for 15 minutes. That's a protein rest. With this much adjunct unmalted grain, you have to do a protein rest, or else you're gonna have all sorts of issues with stability. But it also adds a lot of protein for head retention and flavor. because unmalted grains carry more flavor, that are toasted carry more flavor than malted grains due to the higher presence of starches and proteins that have not been removed through a malting process. During that 15 minutes, you are about, depending on my standard beers, like anything 5%-ish and up, I pull a decoction immediately as soon as I get that temperature, that 125 degrees, and I slowly bring it up to a boil, so it just barely comes to a boil at the end of that 15-minute rest. I add that back in, that raises me up to 145 degrees Fahrenheit, and I hold that for 35 minutes. Now here's where my lighter beers change, because I need to, with a lower grain bill, get a sufficient mouthfeel and flavor profile. I actually will boil this for about 10 minutes. This decoction for 10 minutes on my lighter beers, like my 4.5% and less. It's a little less fermentable, so your grain bill does go up a little bit, but the quality is much better. It doesn't taste and act like a light beer. It acts and tastes like a full beer, but it's lighter in calories and ABV. Anyways, once you add that decoction back in, that'll raise you up to 145 degrees. You're going to hold that in your mash tun for 35 minutes, but as soon as you add that up there and you get to that 145 degrees, you're going to pull a decoction. And you're going to have to calculate that. It's usually 1.25 times whatever it would take if you were doing an infusion of boiling water to get it up there, roughly. That also leaves you plenty of margin for error. You need to confirm before you just let it sit. Anyways, as soon as you get to that temperature, you're going to pull another decoction. You're going to boil that for 30 minutes. So over 5 minutes, it's ramping up to a boil. So that way it has time to convert some of it. Then after that 30 minutes is up and this whole step is done, you're going to add that decoction in. That'll raise you up to 158 degrees Fahrenheit. You're going to hold that for 10 minutes. That should convert whatever's left. Plus, we're going to sparge. I sparge with boiling water. One, it really increases your efficiency as far as getting sugars extracted. It also limits, if you're using a lot of wheat and rye, the chances of it getting stuck. Plus, honestly, it's a consistent temperature. Then I usually boil everything for 30 minutes, unless it's over 6%. If it's going to be over 6%, I boil for 40. I plan on boiling for 40. And that's just because you get more development and color and flavor with that. Now, my hop schedule is pretty consistent. I pretty much always do first wort hops. That's just, you throw some hops in the kettle as you're putting the lautered wort in, and as it's starting to come up to a boil. I usually do about half to 2/3 of my IBUs that way, my bitterness that way. Then once it hits a boil, I throw in the other half to 1/3, usually. It does fluctuate depending on whether I want a soft bitterness or a harsher bitterness. The full boil hops add more of a harsh, like upfront stark bitterness, but the first wort hops tend to be much more softer, and you get a subtle hint of the hops flavor. The first wort hops, they add a more soft, gentle bitterness, and you retain, due to different reactions in the boil, a little more of that hop character to come through. On the other hand, your boil hops, almost all of the volatile oils escape, so you're just left with like a very stark, biting bitterness. So some of that has to do with cumulin levels, but honestly, in my experience, stuff that's put in at the beginning of the boil tends to be very more harsh, and stuff at the first wort tends to be softer, but it's still bitter. Then, I don't really touch any more hops until the very end, to be honest. There's no point. It's just going to boil off anyways. So, I then wait till a whirlpool. I reduce the temperature down to 180 degrees at the end of the boil, and I throw my whirlpool hops in, and then I slowly lower the temperature over about 20 minutes. Down to a little above pitching temperature, knock down to the pitching temperature, and then pitch. Dry hopping, I don't do every beer that way. Some I do, some I don't. It just depends on what I want. But back on whirlpool, obviously the amounts of these total change. Something like a New England style IPA, you're going to have a lot more whirlpool additions and a little bit less boil additions. I would still do a substantial amount of first wort additions, just because that's a very soft bitterness, and in a New England IPA really does have to have that bitterness to make it not be very bland and flat flavored. But a lot of your fruity flavors, you're wanting to get a lot of that fresh hop flavor in that whirlpool, the late additions, plus then your dry hops. Then I open ferment it at whatever temperature I need to. Things that are cool fermented, I usually do somewhere around 55 degrees, and warm fermented beers tend to go around 70, although I have a Diastaticus Belgian yeast that I like to use for different things, especially IPAs, that I usually run at about 85 to 90. But that's personal preference. That's the yeast preference to really kick out, really get done, and really well attenuate and kick out a lot of nice esters and stuff. But then, as soon as the rosin starts to fall, I put it in kegs and seal them, and they naturally carbonate that way. I check the pressure after a few days, and top it off with any CO2 to just get it up to the level I need. Then let it sit for a while and drink it. So we've added our 5 quarts of cold water to this mash now, and then our grains. So now we're within our protein rest range, which is between 125 and 130. We're gonna hold that for 15 minutes. Here's the first decoction, almost finished boiling. Fog. I collected 6 1/4 gallons at 1031 specific gravity after temperature conversion. Boiling the second decoction. I think we've got about 10 minutes left. While we're waiting for the last 10-minute step there at 158, 160, somewhere in there, we're measuring out our first wort hops. It's going to be 0.4 ounces of Archer and 0.25 ounces of Helga. So overall, this is kind of the distribution of hops that I generally use. This one I usually, for the bittering hop for the boil, I usually use a fairly high alpha acid hop if I can get it. And that just makes it easy. I don't have a lot of extra hop material floating around, and it gets the bitterness I want. But usually it's quite a bit of first wort hops. These are usually the ones that I want the flavor to come through, because some of that flavor and aroma does, ironically, manage to make it through the boil to the end. Plus it's a softer bitterness. Then I go to my full boil, and then I go to my whirlpool hops, which are my finishing flavor and aroma hops. You're going to keep a lot more of the flavor and aroma compounds in a 180 degree whirlpool than you will be at flame out. So then this is kind of my general brewing sugar setup. I use a lot of white sugar, and then I use a touch of molasses here and there depending on the recipe. Obviously, paler beers get less molasses because you don't really want a molassesy kind of flavor to come through, kind of a cookie kind of flavor to come through. But in darker stuff, definitely we start using more. This particular arrangement is for a Dunkel Lager that I'm brewing. This is obviously a different day from the stout that this video is about, but this is kind of generally how I'm set up. And this is all done at in that last step of the mash. So that way everything's ready, all you gotta do is just dump it in. And now we're lautering, and there's already hops in the kettle and the burner's on. Kind of video my lautering and sparging. I'm sure there's going to be some complaints about it, but in 5 years of doing it this way, I've never had an issue. Pardon the camera, though. I'm going to be holding it under my chin. I'm not fancy like everybody else. Alright, we just finished lautering. We got tiny bit over 6 gallons. I'm going to take a gravity reading. And 0.4 ounces of Hercules. for 30 minutes. Alright, well, I forgot to record anything else for this brew session, but the original gravity ended up being 1043 with a pre-boil gravity of 1030, but then we adjusted for that with 2 ounces of sugar. So then that all worked out. Added the Whirlpool hops, which it was 0.15 ounces Archer and 0.1 ounce Helga. Forgot to add the coffee in the Whirlpool, so I kind of took some of the wort and brought it back up to a summer and then threw the coffee in it, and then strained it back out and then added it back in as it was cooling down. Right now it is in my cooler, chilling down, so the pitching temperatures from about 110 is what I ended up putting it in there at. And here's the finished dry Irish stout, clearly in a dirty glass, served at fairly low carbonation levels. We're talking 1.5, maybe 2. Trying to go for that kind of cask ale-y kind of deal. Levels of carbonation. Clearly, as you can see, it has fairly decent head retention. I can get about 1/4 to 1/3 of the way into it before it starts to settle out pretty good. Yeah, it's pretty freaking awesome. Next time, I think I would spread out the dark roasted adjunct thinner on more pans in order to get a little more consistent dark roast on, because there are notes of brown malt in there that I don't appreciate. It reminds me of a porter, but it's definitely roastier and darker than a porter. It's basically a very, 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 very dark brown, and it tastes like chocolate and coffee. Plus, I did add coffee to it, but it definitely tastes dark and roasted even before I added the coffee. Anyways, here's for this beer. It's been lagering for a week, so now it's ready.